Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the twin flame reunion timeline is not as long as you think, but only feels long because you are measuring it the wrong way? What if reunion is not delayed by time itself, but by the parts of you that still fear it, resist it, or secretly try to control it? Most people ask, when will reunion happen? But almost nobody asks the deeper question. What if the timeline speeds up the moment something inside me truly changes? In this video, we'll go deep into the hidden truth about the twin flame reunion timeline, why it can suddenly accelerate, why some stages feel endless, and why the shift may come faster than you think once the soul stops repeating the old lesson. Chapter 1: Why the timeline feels longer than it is. One of the most painful things about the twin flame journey is not only the separation itself. It is time. The way time stretches. The way it slows. The way a few weeks can feel like months, and a few months can feel like an entire lifetime. The way silence can make a single day feel heavier than a year once did. And because of that, many people begin asking the same question over and over again. How long will this take? When will reunion happen? How much longer do I have to wait? Why does this timeline feel endless? Why does it feel like nothing is moving, even when something deep inside me says the story is not over? These are real questions, but they often come from a painful misunderstanding. Because the twin flame reunion timeline does not always feel long because it truly is long. Very often, it feels long because pain distorts time. That is the paradox at the beginning of this journey. The soul may be moving through a process of transformation, alignment, release, ego collapse, healing, and preparation, but the human heart experiences that process through longing, uncertainty, and emotional tension. And emotional tension changes the way time is felt. It stretches it. It magnifies it. It makes every delay feel personal. It makes every silence feel permanent. It makes every day without visible movement feel like proof that something is wrong. But what if that is not the full truth? What if the timeline is not always as slow as it feels? What if what you are experiencing as endless delay is partly the result of how the ego experiences uncertainty? That question matters more than most people realize. Because there is a difference between actual spiritual delay and emotional time distortion. Spiritual delay is about what still needs to ripen. Emotional time distortion is about what pain does to perception. And on the twin flame journey, those two things often get confused. When you are deeply attached to an outcome, time stops feeling neutral. It becomes loaded, charged. Every passing day begins carrying emotional meaning. A week is no longer just a week. It becomes still no message, still no answer, still no proof. Still no return. Still no reunion. And the more emotionally invested you are, the heavier each unit of time becomes. This is why a person in longing can feel as if they have been waiting forever, even when the actual external timeline may not be as vast as the nervous system makes it feel. Because longing does not count time the way peace does. Peace lets time move. Longing watches it. And whatever is being watched intensely begins to feel slower. Think about that. Have you ever noticed how time behaves differently depending on your inner state? An hour in joy can disappear in a breath. An hour in fear can feel unbearable. A few minutes in uncertainty can feel endless. A short silence from someone you deeply care about can feel like emotional exile. This is not imagined. It is psychological reality. And in a deeply spiritual bond like the twin flame connection, the effect becomes even stronger because the stakes feel so high. This is not just I miss someone. It feels like part of my soul is unfinished. It feels like something sacred is suspended. It feels like life itself is waiting for an answer. So naturally, time begins to feel stretched beyond proportion. And that is where the first illusion of the reunion timeline begins. You start believing that the timeline itself is the enemy. That time is what is keeping you apart. That months mean failure. That silence means nothing is happening. That visible delay means spiritual delay. But those things are not always the same. Because the soul does not measure time the way the ego does. The ego measures by events. Did they message? Did they come back? Did something change? Did I get a sign? Did the outer world confirm anything today? The soul measures by transformation. Has fear shifted? Has the old pattern weakened? Has the illusion begun dying? Has the lesson been integrated? Has the self become more honest, more grounded, more capable of truth? That is a completely different kind of timeline. And it is one of the biggest reasons the journey feels longer than it often is. Because human perception is waiting for visible proof, while soul movement is often happening invisibly. The ego says, nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, identities may be collapsing, wounds may be surfacing, illusions may be dying, avoidance may be losing power. Inner masculine and feminine energies may be reorganizing. Lessons may be repeating until they no longer need to. That is movement. But because it is not always visible, it often gets dismissed as delay. This is why the beginning of any real understanding of the reunion timeline has to start with a hard truth. You cannot measure a soul process only by what your eyes can confirm. And that is painful. Because the human part of you wants something more concrete. It wants dates, milestones, progress markers, a clear sense that the waiting is leading somewhere. But on this path, the deepest movement often happens in hidden places. And hidden movement feels slow to the ego. Why? Because the ego does not trust what it cannot measure. It wants a reason to relax. It wants a timeline it can predict. It wants to know how much longer it must endure uncertainty. It wants assurance that the pain has not all been for nothing. So it stares at time. And the more it stares, the heavier time becomes. This is what makes the twin flame reunion timeline feel so brutal. It is not only that you are waiting. It is that you are emotionally watching yourself wait. That is a very different experience. It is the difference between being on a train and watching every second on a clock, wondering why the train has not arrived yet. The second experience always feels longer, because the mind is resisting the passage instead of allowing it. Resistance distorts time. Longing distorts time. Fear distorts time. The need for reunion to happen in order for you to feel okay distorts time. This is why the first real shift in understanding the reunion timeline is not about getting a clearer prediction. It is about asking a deeper question. Am I experiencing the timeline as it truly is? Or as my pain interprets it? That question opens everything. Because once you ask it honestly, you begin seeing that what feels too long is not always only about actual time passing. Sometimes it is about the emotional weight being placed on each moment. A single day feels unbearable because it contains too much hope. A single week feels devastating because it contains too much fear. A month feels eternal because it contains too much meaning. And when time carries too much meaning, it becomes distorted. That does not mean the pain is fake. It means the perception is amplified. This matters because many people begin telling themselves stories based on distorted time. Perception. It's been too long. If reunion were meant to happen, it would have happened by now. The delay must mean it's over. Nothing is moving. I'm stuck. But are those statements always true? Or are they sometimes the voice of a nervous system exhausted by uncertainty? That is a crucial distinction. Because the soul can be moving while the mind feels stuck. The connection can be changing while the ego feels abandoned. The timeline can be ripening while the human heart feels left behind. This is why some of the deepest shifts happen in periods people wrongly label as nothing. Nothing visible may be happening. But invisible things may be rearranging everything. An invisible rearrangement is often what later makes the outer change seem sudden. People say, it happened so fast. But often it only looked fast because the deeper movement had been hidden for so long. That is why the timeline feels longer than it is. Not because every stage is short. Some twin flame journeys are genuinely long in calendar time. That should be said honestly. But emotional time is often even longer than calendar time. And when you confuse the two, suffering increases. The soul may be in process. The ego believes it is in prison. The soul may be ripening. The ego believes it is being punished. The soul may be asking for surrender. The ego experiences only delay. This is the opening paradox of the reunion timeline. What feels endless may partly be a spiritual process seen through the magnifying glass of longing. And that is why the first healing on this timeline is not always outer movement. Sometimes it is perception. The realization that delay is not always abandonment. That silence is not always stagnation. That not seeing movement does not mean no movement exists. That what feels long to the wound may still be perfectly timed for the soul. This does not erase the difficulty, but it changes the way you hold it. Because now the question shifts. Instead of only asking, "Why is this taking so long?" you begin asking, "What is making it feel so long?" That question is deeper. Because once you explore it honestly, you may find that part of the pain comes not only from separation, but from what separation activates inside you: fear of uncertainty, fear of powerlessness, fear of not being chosen, fear that your life is being wasted waiting for something you cannot control. And those fears stretch time mercilessly. They turn each day into a test. But what if the real beginning of reunion is learning not to turn every day into evidence of absence? What if the timeline begins changing the moment your relationship to time changes? That is where this conversation gets interesting. Because the reunion timeline is not only about how long something takes. It is also about how consciousness experiences what is taking place. And if consciousness shifts, the felt timeline shifts too. A soul in surrender experiences time differently than a self in panic. A heart in truth experiences silence differently than a heart in control. A person no longer measuring every day by outer signs begins to live in a very different field than someone emotionally counting every hour. That difference can change everything. So before we even ask whether the reunion timeline is faster than you think, we have to understand this first. The timeline often feels longer than it is because pain stretches perception. And once you know that, you stop treating emotional heaviness as absolute proof of spiritual delay. You begin seeing more clearly. Maybe the journey is not as frozen as it feels. Maybe the soul is not as late as the ego believes. Maybe time is not only passing. Maybe it is preparing. And if that is true, then the next question becomes inevitable. If the timeline feels longer because we measure it the wrong way, then how exactly are most people measuring twin flame reunion all wrong? Chapter 2: Why most people measure the reunion timeline wrong. One of the biggest reasons the twin flame reunion timeline feels confusing is because most people are measuring it through the wrong lens. They are measuring it by outer events, by messages, by silence, by visible contact, by whether the other person comes back, by whether a conversation happens, by whether something finally changes in physical reality. And from a human perspective, that makes perfect sense. The mind wants evidence. The heart wants reassurance. The nervous system wants something concrete it can hold and say, "There, now I know I'm not imagining this." So naturally, people begin tracking the journey like this. No text today, still delayed. No call this month, still blocked. No visible movement this year, still in separation. A sign appears, maybe it's close. They look at my story, maybe the timeline is shifting. They reach out, maybe reunion has begun. But here is the deeper truth. Outer movement is not the full timeline. It is only the visible edge of it. And when you measure the whole journey only by what can be seen externally, you end up misunderstanding almost everything that is happening beneath the surface. That is the real problem. Because the twin flame reunion timeline does not begin in the outer world. It begins in consciousness. It begins in lessons, in emotional readiness, in the collapse of old patterns, in the death of illusions, in the quiet inner shifts that happen long before the physical world reflects them. And that means a person can look at the outer world and say, "Nothing is happening," while the soul is actually moving through one of the most important stages of the entire journey. This is why so many people feel hopeless at the exact moment when something profound may already be changing, because they are measuring progress with human eyes only. And human eyes are often too impatient for soul processes. The ego wants movement it can verify. The soul works through movement that often stays invisible until it is ready to take form. That difference changes everything. Imagine planting a seed in the ground. If you judge progress only by what appears above the surface, you might think nothing is happening for a long time. You water the soil, you wait, you look, and there is no visible proof. No leaves, no stem, no flower, nothing that rewards your patience in a way the eye can confirm. So what do you conclude? Maybe it's not growing. Maybe it's dead. Maybe the timing is wrong. Maybe the process has failed. But beneath the soil, life may already be moving. Roots may already be forming. Structure may already be developing. The hidden beginning may already be underway. That is how the twin flame reunion timeline often works. The visible reunion is not the first movement. It is the revealed movement. And if you only measure what is revealed, you will miss almost the entire process that made the revelation possible. This is why people so often say things like, "Nothing has changed. We've been in silence for months. There has been no progress. It feels completely stuck." But what if silence is not always the absence of progress? What if silence is sometimes where the deepest progress happens? That idea is hard for the ego to accept, because the ego thinks in straight lines. If something is progressing, I should see results. If reunion is getting closer, the outer world should look more active. If the bond is real, there should be proof I can track. But soul timelines are not linear in the way human expectations demand. Sometimes there is no visible movement because the old identity is still collapsing. Sometimes there is no message because fear is still losing its power invisibly. Sometimes there is no contact because one or both souls are still inside a lesson that must finish inwardly before it can stabilize outwardly. That is why silence is not always delay. Sometimes silence is preparation. That one truth changes how you see everything. Because when you mistake silence for stagnation, you panic. And when you panic, you start trying to force proof. You overanalyze signs. You obsess over timing. You look for evidence everywhere. You keep emotionally checking the soil to see if the seed has sprouted. And that constant checking creates even more suffering. Not because checking causes the timeline by itself, but because it keeps your perception trapped at the surface level. You stay focused on what is not yet visible, instead of understanding what may already be happening invisibly. This is where most people measure the reunion timeline wrong. They measure it as if reunion is an event waiting to happen. But reunion is also a maturation waiting to complete. And maturation cannot always be tracked by daily evidence. That is the deeper timeline. Not just, when will they text? When will they come back? When will we speak again? But also, when will the old wound stop running the bond? When will the runner-chaser dynamic lose its oxygen? When will fear stop distorting love? When will surrender become real instead of performative? When will inner truth become strong enough to hold outer contact without collapsing back into the same old pattern? Those questions are much harder, but they are much truer. Because outer events alone do not tell you whether the soul is ready. A text can happen early. A reunion can happen prematurely. Contact can reopen while consciousness is still locked in the same old cycle. And when that happens, people often think the timeline has moved forward, when in reality it may have only repeated itself. That is another reason people measure it wrong. They confuse movement with progress. But not all movement is progress. A message is movement. A return is movement. A conversation is movement. But if the same fear, the same projection, the same dependency, the same panic, and the same pattern immediately return with it, then what really changed? This is where the timeline becomes much more subtle than most people expect. Because progress is not only about whether something happens. It is about whether something has transformed enough to hold what happens differently. That is soul timing. And soul timing rarely flatters the ego. The ego wants fast answers. The soul wants stable truth. The ego says, if it's real, it should happen now. The soul says, if it happens now, can it be sustained? That question goes deeper than desire. Because many people are not actually waiting only for contact. They are waiting for contact that means something different than it used to. Contact that is no longer ruled by fear. Contact that is no longer just another opening in the same cycle. Contact that emerges from a changed field, not just a temporary emotional impulse. That is a very different standard. And once you understand that, you stop measuring the reunion timeline only by visible milestones. You begin asking, what is changing in me? What is no longer controlling the connection the way it used to? What old lesson is losing power? What pattern is dying? What illusion is collapsing? Because those things are not side notes to the timeline. They are the timeline. The outer world is only the reflection. Think of a river under ice. On the surface, everything looks frozen, still, unmoving, nothing to report, no evidence of flow. But underneath, the water may still be moving steadily. The fact that the surface is quiet does not mean life has stopped. It means you are looking at the wrong layer. And that is exactly how most people approach twin flame reunion. They stare at the surface and assume the surface is the whole truth. No contact means nothing is moving. No signs means the bond is weakening. No visible shift means the timeline is delayed. But what if the real movement is happening in the layer they are not trained to trust? That is why the reunion timeline often feels so mysterious. Not because it is random, but because it is invisible before it becomes visible. And invisibility makes the ego restless. It wants guarantees. It wants measurable progress. It wants a schedule. But sacred timing does not always give schedules. It gives ripening. That word matters. Because ripening is not the same as waiting passively. Ripening means something is becoming able. Able to hold truth. Able to hold contact. Able to hold love without turning it back into suffering. Able to sustain what once would have collapsed under the weight of fear. That is progress. Even if there is no text today. Even if the outer world is still silent. Even if nothing dramatic has yet happened. This is why measuring the reunion timeline only by outer events creates so much despair. It causes you to overlook the invisible maturity that may already be changing the entire field. And when you overlook that maturity, you become obsessed with the surface. But the surface is always the last thing to change. The inner shift happens first. The outer expression follows. Not always immediately. Not always in the form the ego expects. But almost always in that order. That is the deeper law of this journey. So if you have been measuring reunion only by what you can visibly track, pause. Ask yourself something more honest. Am I measuring true progress? Or am I only measuring visible reassurance? Because those are not the same thing. Visible reassurance comforts the ego. True progress transforms the soul. And the soul does not always transform in public. Sometimes it transforms in silence, in detachment, in ego collapse, in grief, in surrender, in the invisible ending of an old lesson. That is why the reunion timeline is so often misunderstood. People are watching for a flower, while forgetting that roots are the first proof of life. And if the roots are growing, then the timeline may be moving far more than the surface suggests. Which leads to the next deeper question. If most delays are not really about time alone, then what actually slows the reunion timeline down? And more importantly, what makes it suddenly speed up? Chapter 3: The timeline speeds up when the lesson stops repeating. If there is one truth that changes the way you understand the twin flame reunion timeline, it is this. The timeline does not only move through time. It moves through consciousness. And because of that, reunion is not always slowed by the number of days passing. More often, it is slowed by the number of times the same lesson remains unfinished. That is the deeper reality. Because many people think the reunion timeline is mainly about waiting. Waiting long enough. Healing long enough. Suffering long enough. Being patient long enough. But what if length is not the real issue? What if repetition is? What if the reason the journey feels stuck is not because nothing is happening, but because the same inner pattern keeps recreating the same outer experience? That possibility changes everything. Because once you begin seeing the timeline this way, you stop asking only, how much longer will this take? And you begin asking a far more revealing question. What is still repeating in me? That question goes straight to the center. Because the twin flame journey has a way of circling the same wound until the wound is no longer in charge. It circles abandonment. It circles fear of loss. It circles the need to be chosen. It circles the need for proof. It circles emotional dependency. It circles the fantasy that reunion will rescue the self from inner fragmentation. And as long as those patterns remain active, the connection often cannot stabilize into something new. Why? Because what is unresolved gets repeated. That is one of the most important spiritual laws on this path. Not because the universe is punishing you. Not because divine timing is cruel. Not because you are failing. But because consciousness cannot move into a truer chapter while still using the exact same wound to interpret love. So the lesson repeats. Sometimes it repeats loudly. You chase, then collapse. You get a sign, then panic. You feel close, then fear loss. You surrender for a moment, then secretly try to control the outcome again. You tell yourself you are healing, but the same silence still triggers the same story. I'm being abandoned. I'm being forgotten. I'm being left behind. And because the inner interpretation has not fully changed, the emotional timeline keeps looping. This is why the reunion timeline can feel painfully slow. Not because the soul is inactive, but because the same lesson is being lived through different moments again and again. The faces of the experience may change. 1 month it looks like obsession. Another month it looks like grief. Another month it looks like spiritual exhaustion. Another month it looks like hope returning after a sign. But underneath, the same wound may still be speaking. That is repetition. And repetition slows the feeling of progress because it keeps the consciousness tied to the same core pattern. It is like walking in circles inside a forest. You may feel like you are moving constantly. And in a literal sense, you are. But if you keep returning to the same place, then movement has not yet become direction. That is what happens on this journey when the lesson has not completed itself. There is motion, but there is not yet release. This is why some twin flames stay in a cycle for years. Not because they are not spiritual enough. Not because the connection is not real. Not because the reunion is impossible. But because the same lesson still has authority. The same fear still interprets reality. The same attachment still grips the timeline. The same need still asks the other person to provide what only inner transformation can stabilize. And until that changes, time alone does not free the pattern. This is such a hard truth for the human heart to hear. Because the human heart wants to believe that if enough time passes, things will naturally improve. And sometimes they do. Time can create distance. Time can soften intensity. Time can reveal truth. But time by itself does not end repetition. Only awareness does that. Only honesty. Only integration. Only the moment the soul no longer needs to keep learning the lesson through pain. That is when the timeline begins to accelerate. Not because the calendar changed. Because the consciousness did. This is what makes twin flame reunions so mysterious from the outside. People say, nothing happened for so long and then suddenly everything changed. But often it was not truly sudden. The invisible turning point happened when the lesson finally stopped repeating. When the same silence no longer triggered the same panic. When the same uncertainty no longer created the same emotional collapse. When the same longing no longer turned into self-abandonment. When the same bond was no longer interpreted through the same fear. That is the real acceleration. And it often happens quietly. So quietly that the ego misses how important it is. Because the ego expects acceleration to look dramatic. A text, a call, a reunion scene, an obvious breakthrough. But the soul knows acceleration begins earlier. It begins the moment the loop weakens. The moment the old reaction does not fully take over. The moment the wounded self is no longer the only one speaking. The moment you stop using the connection to repeat an old emotional story. That is the true turning point. Think about how many times the journey may have asked you the same question in different forms. Can you love without losing yourself? Can you stay present without forcing? Can you feel uncertainty without turning it into fear? Can you stop making silence mean rejection? Can you stop asking outer movement to heal inner instability? If the answer keeps being, not yet, the timeline often keeps circling. Not as punishment, as invitation. Because the soul is not interested in rushing you into an outer outcome that the inner world still cannot hold differently. That is why the timeline speeds up when the lesson stops repeating. Not when the ego gets tired of waiting. Not when you demand a sign. Not when you try harder. But when something in you becomes incapable of going back into the same distortion with the same innocence. This is the sacred exhaustion point. The point where the old cycle stops feeling meaningful. You stop romanticizing your own suffering. You stop mistaking obsession for devotion. You stop turning every sign into a survival mechanism. You stop believing that more longing automatically means more truth. And because of that, the old lesson loses some of its power. You begin seeing it. Not just feeling it. Seeing it. Seeing how you repeated fear. Seeing how you kept trying to use the future to calm the present. Seeing how you asked reunion to rescue places in you that needed your own presence first. That sight is powerful. Because what is clearly seen begins losing the ability to unconsciously rule you. And that is how repetition starts ending. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But truly. You may still feel pain. You may still love deeply. You may still want reunion. But now the wanting is less entangled with the same wound. The silence may still ache, but it no longer defines your worth in the same way. The timeline may still be unknown, but it no longer feels like a sentence being imposed on your soul. The bond may still matter, but it no longer forces you to relive the same emotional loop to feel real. That is acceleration. Because the soul no longer has to keep stopping at the same lesson. It can move. This is why some people suddenly experience a rapid shift after what felt like endless stillness. It is not always because fate randomly changed its mind. It is because a deep repetition ended. And once repetition ends, energy that was trapped in the loop becomes available for movement. That movement may first happen internally. More peace. Less panic. Less need for signs. Less obsession with timing. Less emotional dependence on the next outer shift. And then often the outer world begins reflecting that inner change. Communication opens. Timing softens. Distance feels less fixed. The energy between the two people becomes less tangled. But the outer acceleration is usually the echo. The real acceleration began when the lesson stopped consuming the consciousness in the same way. That is why the question is not only, how long is my twin flame reunion timeline? A deeper question is, what am I still repeating that makes the path feel longer? That is a much braver question. Because it shifts the focus away from helpless waiting and toward conscious seeing. Not blame. Seeing. Seeing what the soul has been trying to teach beneath every cycle. Maybe the lesson was never only about them. Maybe it was about your relationship to fear. Your relationship to uncertainty. Your relationship to being chosen. Your relationship to abandonment. Your relationship to the self when love cannot yet take the form you want. And once that relationship changes, the timeline changes too. That is why so many people are surprised when the energy suddenly shifts after a long stagnant period. They think, how did it move so fast? But the truth is, it did not move fast. It became free. Free from the same repetition. And freedom always looks sudden to the part of us that was trapped in the loop. So if you feel like the journey has been circling, if you feel like the same pain keeps returning under different names, if the timeline feels slow beyond reason, do not only ask how much longer it will take. Ask what is still repeating. Because repetition is often the true delay. And once repetition ends, something remarkable happens. Time no longer feels like the enemy. It becomes the space in which the soul finally stopped needing to learn the same lesson through the same wound. That is when the timeline begins to breathe again. That is when reunion can begin moving not just in calendar time, but in truth. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If repetition slows the path, then what makes the whole journey feel truly endless from the inside? The answer is deeper still. It is not only repetition. It is resistance. Chapter 4: Why Inner Resistance Makes the Journey Feel Endless. There is something even more painful than waiting on the twin flame journey. It is resisting while you wait. Because waiting by itself is hard. But resistance turns waiting into suffering. That is one of the deepest reasons the reunion timeline can feel endless. Not only because time is passing. Not only because the outer world is quiet. Not only because the answer has not yet taken visible form. But because inside, something is still fighting what is. Fighting the silence. Fighting the uncertainty. Fighting the pace of the journey. Fighting the loss of control. Fighting the possibility that love may not arrive in the form, timing, or sequence the ego demanded. And that fight changes everything. Because resistance does not just make pain stronger. It makes time heavier. It makes each day feel like a burden. It makes each delay feel personal. It makes each unknown feel intolerable. It turns the present moment into something you are constantly trying to escape. That is why inner resistance can make the journey feel endless even when something meaningful is already unfolding underneath. Because resistance traps consciousness inside what has not happened yet. It says, this should be different by now. It should be clearer by now. They should have returned by now. The signs should be stronger by now. The suffering should have ended by now. The reunion should already be here. And beneath all of those thoughts is one deeper demand. Reality should move according to what my pain can tolerate. That is resistance. Not because you are weak. Not because your longing is false. Not because the love is unreal. But because the human self does not naturally know how to rest inside uncertainty. It wants movement. It wants proof. It wants reassurance. It wants to shorten the distance between desire and form. And when that shortening does not happen, the ego begins pushing inwardly against the entire process. That inward pushing is exhausting. You may not even realize how often it happens. You tell yourself you are surrendering, but inside you are still arguing with the pace. You say you trust the bond, but inside you are still demanding signs. You say you are letting go, but inside you are still monitoring the timeline every day. You say you accept what is, but inside you are still emotionally negotiating with the universe. This is the hidden friction that makes the journey feel so long. Because resistance creates drag. And drag changes how the path is experienced. Imagine trying to walk through water while also pushing against the current with all your strength. Every step becomes harder. Every movement becomes slower. Every inch feels earned through exhaustion. And after a while, you may conclude that the path itself is impossible. But maybe the path is not the only thing making it hard. Maybe the resistance is. This is one of the most humbling truths of the twin flame reunion timeline. Sometimes what feels like delay is not only timing. It is the emotional friction created by fighting the lesson you are in. That lesson can take many forms. Accepting uncertainty. Releasing control. Letting the other person remain in their process without trying to force awakening. Stopping the habit of using signs as emotional oxygen. Allowing silence to exist without turning it into punishment. Allowing the bond to be sacred without needing it to constantly perform reassurance. These are not small lessons. They cut directly into the ego's habits. Because the ego does not want openness. It wants management. It wants to manage the mystery, manage the timeline, manage the pain, manage the meaning of every sign, every silence, every shift in energy. But sacred love cannot be fully managed. And that truth creates enormous resistance in the part of you that still believes safety comes from control. This is why inner resistance often looks like obsession. Not because obsession is only about longing, but because obsession is often the mind's attempt to regain control over what it cannot emotionally tolerate not knowing. You obsess over signs, over dreams, over spiritual confirmations, over what they said, what they did not say, what the silence means, what divine timing might be doing, what the next step could be. And every act of mental gripping tells the nervous system the same thing. This moment is not safe until I understand it. That belief is one of the core engines of resistance. Because now the present is no longer just incomplete. It is unacceptable. And when the present becomes unacceptable, time begins feeling unbearable. That is why resistance makes the journey feel endless. Not because the soul has stopped moving, but because the ego has stopped allowing the present to be anything other than a problem. That creates a terrible kind of inner pressure. You are no longer simply on a journey. You are emotionally bracing against it every day. And bracing drains the spirit. It drains your capacity to trust. It drains your ability to feel what is changing beneath the surface. It drains your access to peace. It keeps the whole path organized around not yet. That phrase matters. Not yet. When resistance is active, everything becomes not yet. Not yet reunited. Not yet healed. Not yet chosen. Not yet safe. Not yet resolved. Not yet enough. And if you live inside not yet long enough, you begin to feel as though life itself is postponed. That is one of the deepest forms of suffering on this journey. Because now the timeline is not only about when reunion happens. It becomes the measure of when you think you are allowed to exhale. When you are allowed to relax. When you are allowed to feel complete. When you are allowed to stop carrying the ache of unfinishedness. And when reunion becomes emotionally tied to your permission to live. Of course the timeline feels endless. How could it not? Every day without visible movement now feels like a withholding of life itself. That is what resistance does. It does not just want the future. It refuses the present. And the more the present is refused, the slower time feels. This is why resistance is so deceptive. It often feels like devotion. It often feels like intensity. It often feels like caring deeply. But underneath, it is often fear refusing to be where it is. Fear refusing to accept uncertainty. Fear refusing to release control. Fear refusing to let the soul move on a timeline the ego cannot command. That does not make you wrong. It makes you human. But it does reveal something important. Inner resistance can make the reunion timeline feel much longer than the soul itself experiences it. Because the soul is not fighting the present in the same way. The soul may ache, yes. It may long, yes. It may still deeply honor the connection. But the soul is oriented toward truth. The ego is oriented toward relief. And when relief becomes the only acceptable outcome, resistance grows. This is also why many people feel even more stuck the harder they try to speed up the journey. Through force. They chase more signs. More readers. More spiritual explanations. More reassurance. More attempts to decode timing. But the more they try to force certainty, the less spacious the inner world becomes. And without space, the journey feels tight, constricted, heavy, endless. It is like trying to open your hand by clenching harder. You only increase the tension. This is what resistance does to time. It wraps every moment in expectation, and then suffers when reality does not comply fast enough. So what is the deeper invitation here? Not passivity. Not giving up. Not pretending the longing is gone. The invitation is softer and harder than that. To stop warring with the pace of what is unfolding. To stop turning the present into an enemy because it does not yet contain the form you want. To stop demanding that you're healing, they're healing, divine timing. And soul readiness all obey the urgency of your pain. That is where surrender begins to become real. Not as a concept, as an ending of inner argument. This does not mean you stop wanting reunion. It means the wanting no longer stands on the throat of the present. You still desire. You still care. You still honor the bond. But you stop fighting reality every day because it has not become tomorrow yet. That shift is profound. Because the moment resistance softens, time changes. Not necessarily in the calendar first. In your field. The days stop feeling like a punishment. The silence stops feeling like a personal attack. The unknown stops feeling like proof of abandonment. The path stops feeling like something you have to emotionally survive hour by hour. That does not erase pain. But it removes the extra suffering that resistance was adding to it. And once that extra suffering begins falling away, the journey often feels lighter, cleaner, less endless, less emotionally suffocating. Why? Because resistance is no longer stretching each moment into a battle. That alone can feel like acceleration. And often it is. Because when resistance softens, the old lessons lose some of their grip. The repeated loops begin weakening. The need to control begins loosening. The ego stops creating so much drag. And in that reduced drag, movement becomes easier. Not because the soul was waiting to reward you for doing surrender correctly, but because the field is no longer so crowded with inner opposition. This is why the reunion timeline often begins shifting the moment you stop trying to emotionally wrestle it into existence. The path breathes differently when you do. So if the journey has felt endless, if the waiting has felt unbearable, if every day has felt heavy with meaning and lack and not yet, ask yourself gently, what am I resisting right now? The silence? The uncertainty? The pace? The lesson? The loss of control? The fact that I cannot force what must ripen? Because resistance to any of those things can make the path feel far longer than it truly is. And once you begin seeing that, something powerful becomes possible. You stop measuring delay only by the outer world. You begin seeing the inner friction that has been magnifying it. And that seeing is part of freedom. Because what you can see clearly, you no longer have to unconsciously obey. So yes, inner resistance can make the twin flame reunion timeline feel endless. But the moment resistance begins softening, the whole journey begins changing shape. Not because the soul suddenly moved faster, but because you stopped pulling against what was already trying to carry you somewhere deeper. And once that happens, another mystery begins revealing itself. Sometimes the timeline is speeding up precisely when it feels less intense. Precisely when you check less, panic less, control less, need less proof. Which leads us to the next question. How do you know your reunion timeline is actually accelerating even before the outer world confirms it? Chapter 5: The Hidden Signs Your Reunion Timeline is Accelerating. One of the strangest truths about the twin flame reunion timeline is this. The timeline often begins accelerating in the exact moment you think nothing is happening. Not when the signs become louder. Not when the outer world suddenly becomes dramatic. Not when you finally get the message you were waiting for. But when something subtle begins changing inside you. And because it is subtle, many people miss it. They miss it because they are still looking for acceleration to appear in the form of visible movement. They assume that if reunion is getting closer, they should feel more urgency, more intensity, more signs, more emotional proof, more obvious activity in the outer world. But very often the opposite happens. As the reunion timeline begins accelerating, the inner world starts becoming quieter. And that quiet can be deeply confusing if you have spent a long time associating intensity with progress. You may think, why am I calmer? Why am I checking less? Why do I still care deeply, but without the same panic? Why does the bond feel quieter, but somehow deeper? Why does something in me feel like it is moving forward, even though the outer world has not fully shown it yet? These are not always signs of disconnection. They are often signs of alignment. That is one of the hidden paradoxes of this journey. Many people believe less intensity means less progress. But often, less intensity means less distortion. And when distortion begins to fall away, the timeline can move much faster than the ego expects. Because the ego confuses noise with movement. The soul does not. The soul understands that real acceleration often begins when the old emotional drag starts. Disappearing. Less fear. Less control. Less desperation. Less emotional dependence on signs. Less need to force certainty out of mystery. Those things do not feel dramatic. But they matter enormously. Because for so long, the timeline may have felt slow not only because of outer circumstances, but because the inner field was crowded with panic, repetition, resistance, fantasy, and the need for reunion to function as emotional rescue. When those things begin weakening, something extraordinary happens. The path becomes lighter. And a lighter path moves differently. That is why one of the hidden signs your reunion timeline is accelerating is this. You stop checking as much. That may sound almost too simple. But think about what checking really means. Checking their profile. Checking for signs. Checking tarot. Checking energy. Checking whether the universe is finally giving you proof. Checking is rarely just curiosity. It is often anxiety looking for relief. So when you begin checking less, it can mean something profound is shifting. Not that you care less, but that your nervous system is no longer relying on constant external confirmation in the same way. That is huge. Because every time you needed to check, the timeline was being experienced through lack. Through not yet. Through absence. Through an emotional need for proof that something was still alive. But when that checking relaxes, the field changes. The connection is no longer being fed by urgency in the same way. It is being held in a quieter, more stable way. That is often a sign of acceleration. Another hidden sign is that you panic less. The silence may still exist. The uncertainty may still exist. The questions may still not have full answers. But your relationship to those things changes. The silence no longer feels like immediate emotional danger. The unknown no longer destroys your whole day. A delay no longer automatically means abandonment in the same way. This is not emotional numbness. It is nervous system maturation. And nervous system maturation matters more to reunion than most people realize. Because real reunion is not only about love returning. It is about whether love can now land in a field that does not instantly turn it back into panic. So if you are panicking less, the timeline may already be changing. Not because the outer world is finally rewarding you, but because the inner world is becoming more capable of receiving what once would have overwhelmed it. That is readiness. And readiness often speeds things up in ways the ego cannot track immediately. Another sign your reunion timeline is accelerating is that you think about the connection less compulsively, but more clearly. This is another paradox people misread. They think, if I am not obsessing as much, maybe the bond is fading. But obsession is not the same as sacredness. Obsession is often fear trying to maintain control through constant mental presence. So when the mind begins releasing that compulsion, it does not necessarily mean the bond is weaker. It can mean the bond is no longer being interpreted through the same mental distortion. Now, when you think of them, it may feel cleaner, simpler, less chaotic, less tied to emotional emergency. You may still feel deeply. You may still know the connection matters, but the thoughts no longer own you in the same way. That is a hidden sign of acceleration. Because the timeline moves differently once the mind stops constantly pulling it through fear. Another sign is that the bond feels quieter, but deeper. This one is especially important. Earlier in the journey, the connection may have felt loud, explosive, emotionally overwhelming, full of psychic intensity, signs, confusion, fear, longing, dramatic highs and lows. And because that stage is so emotionally charged, people often assume it must mean the connection is more active. But activity is not always alignment. Sometimes activity is turbulence. And when turbulence begins settling, people mistakenly think the connection is becoming weaker. But what if it is becoming truer? What if the loudness was the wound reacting, and the quietness is the soul settling? That is often what happens when the reunion timeline begins accelerating. The bond becomes less theatrical, but more real. Less dramatic, but more grounded. Less fueled by panic, but more steady in its presence. You may not feel that as exciting at first. But spiritually, it is far more significant than another emotional storm. Because when the bond becomes quieter and deeper, it means it is no longer being carried mainly by the old patterns. And that changes the entire timeline. Another hidden sign is that you are less attached to the timeline itself. This may be one of the clearest indicators of all. Earlier, every question may have been about when. When will they come back? When will I hear from them? When will the silence break? When will reunion happen? And while those questions are understandable, they can also trap the whole journey inside emotional waiting. But then something shifts. You still care. You still wonder sometimes. You may still deeply want reunion. But the timeline no longer owns your peace in the same way. You are no longer emotionally measuring every day. You are no longer turning every week into proof of delay. You are no longer living with your nervous system wrapped around the calendar. This does not mean the desire disappeared. It means your center has started returning to you. And once your center returns to you, the timeline often accelerates because the path is no longer being clogged by the same fear-based urgency. That does not mean you caused all previous delay through wanting too much. It is not about blame. It is about field. A desperate field moves differently than a grounded field. A gripping field moves differently than a surrendered one. A nervous system that needs reunion to survive interprets reality differently than one that can now hold the bond without collapsing. That difference matters. Another sign is that old patterns no longer feel meaningful. This is subtle but powerful. The chase starts feeling empty. The obsessive hope crash cycle starts feeling exhausting instead of romantic. The need to decode every sign starts feeling hollow. The old emotional drama no longer feels spiritually important. Why does this matter? Because when the old pattern loses its emotional glamour, it begins losing its grip. And when the pattern loses its grip, repetition weakens. And when repetition weakens, the timeline opens. That is a deep form of acceleration. Not a visible event. A release of the thing that kept recreating the same energetic loop. You may also notice that your life begins calling you back. This is another hidden sign many people overlook. You feel more present in your own path. More available to your own healing. More connected to your purpose, your creativity, your body, your daily life. You stop living entirely inside spiritual suspense. This does not mean you forgot them. It means your soul is no longer paused. And that is important because a soul that is no longer paused is no longer relating to reunion as the only doorway into life. That shift often speeds up the timeline more than people realize. Because now reunion is not being asked to substitute for your own aliveness. Now it can become a reflection of it. Another sign is peace that feels unfamiliar. This is one of the most overlooked signs of all. You may feel less reactive, less emotionally frantic, less desperate for reassurance. And at first, because it feels unfamiliar, you may misread it. You may think something is wrong. You may think the connection is fading. You may think your feelings are weakening. But often, this peace is the exact sign that the old distortion is losing power. And when distortion loses power, timelines change quickly. Not always visibly right away, but deeply. Because now the field is no longer spending so much energy on survival. It is becoming available for truth. That is why acceleration often begins in silence. In less checking. In less panic. In less obsession. In less need to measure every moment. These things may not satisfy the ego, but they are powerful signs that the reunion timeline is no longer being delayed by the same inner conditions. So if you have been feeling calmer, quieter, less attached to signs, less trapped by the clock, more rooted in yourself, and strangely less interested in the old emotional drama, even though the connection still feels sacred. Do not rush to assume that nothing is happening. Some of the strongest signs of acceleration are invisible to the part of you that only trusts. Spectacle. Because reunion often moves faster than you think the moment the soul stops needing pain to measure. Progress. That is the real turning point. Not more intensity. More alignment. Not more emotional noise. More truth. And once that truth begins settling into the heart, something very mysterious becomes possible. What looked like nothing happening may actually be the exact stage right before everything changes. Because sometimes the timeline does not speed up loudly. Sometimes it speeds up in silence. Until the outer world finally reveals what the soul has been preparing all along. Chapter 6: Why Some Twin Flames Reunite Suddenly. One of the most mysterious things about the twin flame journey is how reunion can seem impossible. For such a long time, and then suddenly feel as if everything changes at once. For months, sometimes years, there is silence. Distance. Confusion. No visible movement. No clear answer. No outer confirmation that anything is getting closer. And then, unexpectedly, something shifts. A message arrives. A conversation opens. A wall comes down. A reunion that once felt unreachable suddenly feels natural, almost inevitable. And this leaves many people asking the same question. How did it happen so fast? But the deeper truth is this. It usually did not happen fast. It only became visible fast. That distinction matters. Because what looks sudden in the outer world is often the result of a long invisible process. Unfolding underneath the surface. The soul may have been moving for a long time. Lessons may have been ripening. Wounds may have been surfacing and weakening. The old dynamic may have been losing its power quietly. Inner resistance may have been collapsing without the outer world showing immediate proof. So when the visible shift finally happens, the ego thinks, this came out of nowhere. But the soul knows. No, this was building for a long time. This is one of the deepest truths about sudden twin flame reunion. Nothing then everything. That is how it often appears. But that pattern does not mean the journey was inactive before the outer breakthrough. It means the most important movement was happening in hidden places first. Think about water heating on a stove. For a long time, nothing dramatic seems to happen. The pot looks the same. The surface looks calm. There is no visible transformation that satisfies impatience. But under the surface, temperature is rising. Molecules are moving faster. Pressure is building. The invisible conditions for change are being created moment by moment. Then a threshold is reached. And suddenly, what looks still becomes boiling. To the impatient eye, it appears abrupt. But the truth is, the boiling was prepared in silence. That is how many twin flame reunions unfold. The visible turning point is often only the final expression of a long period of hidden preparation. This matters because many people quit trusting the process too early. They look at the silent stage and conclude. Nothing is changing. The timeline is frozen. The bond is inactive. The distance means it is over. But what if silence is not emptiness? What if silence is the heating phase? What if the apparent stillness is where the real acceleration has been taking place all along? That is why some twin flames reunite suddenly. Not because the universe changed its mind overnight. Not because fate randomly intervened at the last minute. Not because all the years before meant nothing. But because enough invisible conditions finally aligned. The old lesson weakened. The old resistance softened. The old fear lost some of its control. The old runner-chaser pattern began collapsing. The bond stopped being filtered through the same distortion. And once those changes reach a certain threshold, outer reality can move quickly. That is the key word. Threshold. The journey often looks slow because the soul is moving toward a threshold the ego cannot see. And until that threshold is reached, the outer world may remain frustratingly quiet. But once it is reached, movement can happen with surprising speed. This is why some separations feel endless, and yet the actual shift into reunion looks almost immediate. Months of no contact, then a message. Years of inner tension, then one honest conversation changes everything. Long emotional distance, then suddenly both people are no longer standing inside the same defenses. Again, to the mind, this looks abrupt. But spiritually, it is often overdue. Not overdue in a bitter sense. Overdue in the sense that the unseen work has finally matured enough to take form. This is also why people often misunderstand others' reunion stories. They hear someone say, "We didn't speak for 2 years," and then suddenly they came back. And they focus only on the visible return. But what they do not see is everything that happened underneath those 2 years. The identities that died. The illusions that cracked. The pain that matured into wisdom. The fear that became unbearable enough to release. The chase that exhausted itself. The silence that stripped both souls of what could not continue. The outer moment was only the visible doorway. The real journey had already been happening. This should change how you look at your own timeline. Because if you only trust what is visible, you will always think the sudden shift belongs to luck, fate, or mystery beyond understanding. But if you look more deeply, you begin to see that sudden reunion often belongs to accumulated inner change. An accumulated change can stay hidden for a very long time. That is why the final stage often feels so strange. You may feel calmer before anything happens. Quieter. Less attached to forcing movement. Less emotional about the old pattern. More rooted in yourself. And because outer proof is still missing, you may assume you are simply in another silent phase. But what if that quieter phase is exactly the final preparation? What if the reason the shift is close is not because everything feels louder, but because everything false is finally losing its grip? This is the paradox people rarely understand. They expect the timeline to speed up through more intensity. More signs. More drama. More emotional electricity. But often, the timeline speeds up through less. Less panic. Less checking. Less control. Less dependency on proof. Less participation in the old pain cycle. That less creates room. And once there is room, reality can move more cleanly. This is why some twin flames reunite suddenly after a period that feels almost empty. That emptiness was not dead space. It was clearing space. Space where the old identity no longer ruled. Space where the soul no longer needed the same lesson repeated. Space where reunion was no longer being asked to save the self from itself. And when that space becomes available, the shift can happen fast. Not because it was rushed. Because it was finally no longer blocked by what had to end first. This is also why sudden reunion often feels different than imagined. People expect it to feel explosive. But when it comes after deep inner preparation, it may feel surprisingly natural. A simple text. A direct conversation. A calm opening. A familiar soul meeting you in a way that no longer feels like emotional chaos. And that can actually be shocking. Because after so much pain, the ego expects the shift to announce itself dramatically. But truth often arrives with less theater than fantasy. The message may be ordinary. The words may be simple. The moment may be quiet. Yet the energy is entirely different. Why? Because what makes reunion real is not how dramatic it looks. It is what is no longer standing in the way of it. That is the hidden reason some reunions happen suddenly. Not because the person changed overnight. Not because divine timing is random. Not because the outer world finally became merciful. But because the inner field reached a point where the old obstruction could no longer hold the same power. And once the obstruction weakens enough, the path opens quickly. That is how thresholds work. Not gradually in the way the ego prefers, but in a way that seems sudden because the change was gathering invisibly all along. Think again of dawn. The sun does not appear the moment darkness begins to end. For a long stretch, the night seems unchanged. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sky begins shifting. But if you are impatient, you may not notice the subtle stages. You may only notice the moment the horizon becomes visibly lit. And then you say, It happened all at once. But it did not. You just could not see the earlier part. That is how the twin flame reunion timeline often behaves. The visible reunion is the horizon lighting up. The real movement began much earlier. So if you are in a stage that feels silent, stripped, uncertain, and strangely still, do not assume that stillness means nothing is happening. Stillness can be the final heating phase, the final ripening, the final invisible reorganization before the threshold breaks. And if that is true, then what looks like delay may actually be accumulation. Accumulation of truth. Accumulation of surrender. Accumulation of emotional readiness. Accumulation of the ending of old patterns. And once enough of that accumulates, the shift can look astonishingly fast. That is why some twin flames reunite suddenly. Because the soul moves below the surface for far longer than the ego can tolerate. But when the soul finally reaches the threshold, outer life catches up quickly. And the world calls it sudden. But the soul calls it ready. So if you feel like nothing is happening, remember this. Some of the deepest changes happen long before the outer world reveals them. Some of the fastest reunions are built in silence. Some of the most dramatic breakthroughs are prepared in invisible layers. Some of the most beautiful returns happen only after the old self has stopped demanding that they happen on command. The shift may come faster than you think. Not because it is random, but because what you cannot yet see may already be far closer to completion than your fear realizes. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more important. What is the deepest inner change that can make the timeline move faster than almost anything else? The answer is not more longing, not more signs, not more effort. It is the moment you stop needing reunion to save you. Chapter 7: The timeline changes the moment you stop needing reunion to save you. There is a moment on the twin flame journey that changes everything. Not because the other person suddenly returns. Not because the silence instantly breaks. Not because the universe finally gives you a sign dramatic enough to calm every fear. Not because the timeline suddenly becomes predictable. But because something inside you stops asking reunion to save you. That is one of the deepest turning points on the path. And it is also one of the hardest. Because for a long time, many people do not only want reunion. They need it. They need it to end the uncertainty. They need it to validate the bond. They need it to heal the pain. They need it to settle the question of whether they were right to believe. They need it to fill the emptiness that separation exposed. They need it to restore a part of themselves they now feel they cannot access without the other person. That need is understandable. When a connection reaches that deeply into your soul, it does not feel casual. It feels consequential. It feels sacred. It feels like life itself has been split into before and after. So naturally, reunion can start feeling like the answer to everything. The answer to the ache. The answer to the confusion. The answer to the sleepless nights, the signs, the longing, the waiting, the inner death. The endless questioning. And slowly, without even realizing it, reunion becomes more than a possibility. It becomes emotional salvation. That is where the timeline gets heavy. Because the moment reunion becomes the thing that must happen in order for you to feel whole. Okay. Chosen, complete, or spiritually safe, the entire path becomes burdened by your need. Not because desire is wrong, but because need changes the frequency of love. Desire can be open. Need grips. Desire says, I deeply want this. Need says, I cannot truly live until this happens. And the more reunion becomes tied to your survival, the more every day without it feels unbearable. That is why the timeline can suddenly feel impossible. Because now, you are not just waiting for love. You are waiting for permission to breathe. That is too much weight for any outcome to carry. And at some point, the soul begins revealing that truth. Painfully. Clearly. Relentlessly. It shows you that no matter how sacred the bond is, no matter how real the connection may be, reunion cannot sustainably enter a field where it is being asked to rescue the self from itself. That is the deeper reason this inner shift matters so much. Because real reunion is not just about the other person arriving. It is about whether you are now able to receive the connection without turning it into emotional life support. And that capacity changes the timeline in profound ways. When you stop needing reunion to save you, something in the energy relaxes. Not because you care less. Not because the bond becomes less meaningful. Not because the soul suddenly becomes detached. But because the symbolic burden placed on the other person begins to dissolve. They are no longer being unconsciously asked to prove your worth, to restore your inner stability, to settle your abandoned places, to heal your fragmentation through their return. That release matters more than most people realize. Because the timeline often feels slow, not only due to outer circumstances, but because the connection is being filtered through enormous inner pressure. Pressure to resolve. Pressure to validate. Pressure to mean everything. Pressure to finally end the suffering. And pressure distorts everything it touches. It distorts perception. It distorts timing. It distorts the felt experience of the bond. It turns love into urgency and the future into emotional oxygen. So what happens when that pressure begins to lift? The field changes. The love becomes cleaner. The timeline becomes lighter. The soul stops trying to force what must unfold through truth, not desperation. That is when movement can happen differently. This is why the reunion timeline often shifts the moment you stop using reunion as rescue. Because rescue is rooted in fear. Rescue says, "Come back so I can feel okay. Choose me so I can believe in myself. Return so I can finally rest. Reunite with me so this pain can justify itself." But sacred union cannot be built on that kind of bargain. Not because the longing is impure, but because love cannot become stable while it is being used to compensate for an unhealed inner collapse. This is what makes the twin flame journey so brutally honest. It does not let you hide inside romantic ideas forever. Eventually, it asks the deeper question. If reunion never came in the exact form you imagined, would you still return to yourself? That question terrifies the ego. Because the ego has built so much around the hope of reunion. It has made reunion into the final answer, the final redemption, the final explanation, the final doorway out of pain. But the soul is asking for something else. Not for you to stop loving. For you to stop abandoning yourself while you love. That is the shift. The moment you stop needing reunion to save you is the moment you begin saving your own center from being handed over to the future. And that changes the timeline powerfully. Because now reunion is no longer being asked to create wholeness. It is being invited to meet it. That is a completely different field. One field says, "I need you to arrive so I can become real." The other says, "I am becoming real enough that if you arrive, I can meet you differently." That difference is enormous. In the first field, every silence feels like death. In the second, silence may still ache, but it no longer annihilates your identity. In the first field, every sign becomes survival. In the second, signs may still matter, but they no longer determine whether you can function. In the first field, time feels endless. In the second, time begins feeling more like a process than a punishment. This is why the reunion timeline can accelerate once this interchange happens. Not because the universe is rewarding detachment, but because the field is no longer so crowded with desperation, symbolic burden, and emotional gripping. There is space now. Space for truth. Space for natural movement. Space for outer reality to reflect inner alignment instead of compensating for inner collapse. That is sacred. And it often begins in ways so subtle that people misread them. You may notice that you are less desperate for signs. Less attached to constant reassurance. Less interested in turning every silence into a crisis. Less willing to call your suffering devotion, just because it feels intense. At first, this may frighten you. You may think, why am I calmer? Why do I still care, but without the same urgency? Why am I less dependent on the outcome to get through my day? Have I given up? But this is not always giving up. Sometimes it is the first honest form of surrender. And surrender is not the death of desire. It is the death of using desire as a substitute for self-return. That is why this stage is so important. Because when reunion is no longer needed to save you, the love itself begins changing form. It becomes less grasping, less dramatic, less dependent on timing for meaning. And paradoxically, that often makes outer reunion more possible. Why? Because now, the other person is no longer being approached energetically, emotionally, spiritually as the sole holder of your peace. Now the connection has room to breathe, room to be real, room to be mutual, room to be honest, room to unfold without carrying the entire weight of your unhealed inner life. That is what speeds things up in ways people rarely understand. Not trying harder, not longing more, not chasing more signs, but becoming less desperate for reunion to function as salvation. This is not coldness. It is maturity. It is the moment the soul says, I still love deeply. I still honor what this is. I still sense the sacredness of this bond. But I no longer need this reunion to rescue me from myself. I am no longer willing to postpone my life, my peace, my wholeness, and my ability to breathe until the outer world finally changes. That realization is huge. Because once it arrives, the old dynamic begins losing its fuel. The future is no longer holding all the power. The timeline is no longer holding your peace hostage. The bond is no longer being turned into a desperate answer for every wound inside you. And when that happens, something remarkable begins. You become available to reunion in a different way. Not as a wounded self begging for salvation, but as a soul becoming capable of meeting sacred love without disappearing inside it. That is the kind of inner change that can shift the entire timeline. Because now reunion is no longer being forced to carry what belonged to your own healing all along. Now it can become what it was always meant to be. Not rescue. Resonance. Not completion through lack. Meeting through truth. Not an escape from your inner emptiness. A reflection of your growing wholeness. This is the great paradox of the twin flame reunion timeline. The moment you stop needing reunion to save you is often the moment the timeline changes most. Powerfully. Because need creates contraction. Truth creates space. And sacred love moves more clearly through space than through desperation. So if you have reached a stage where something in you is quieter, less frantic, less dependent on the outer outcome to make life feel bearable, do not assume you are losing the connection. You may be losing the distortion that was slowing your experience of it. And that loss is holy. Because reunion was never meant to replace your relationship with yourself. It was meant to meet you after you stopped abandoning that relationship in the name of love. That is the turning point. That is the hidden acceleration. And from there, the next question becomes even deeper. If the timeline changes when you stop needing reunion to save you, then what exactly is divine? Timing? Is it random? Or does it meet something inside you when the soul is finally ready to hold what it once could only long for? Chapter 8: Divine Timing versus Emotional Readiness. Few phrases are repeated more often on the twin flame journey than this one. Trust divine timing. People say it when you are hurting. They say it when the silence stretches. They say it when reunion feels close, but nothing visible happens. They say it when the connection seems suspended between longing and mystery. And while the phrase is not wrong, it is often left far too shallow. Because what does divine timing actually mean? Does it mean everything is predetermined no matter what? Does it mean you are powerless until the universe randomly decides the moment has arrived? Does it mean reunion will happen when fate says so, regardless of inner readiness, emotional maturity, or the state of the bond itself? At first, many people assume yes. They imagine divine timing as something completely outside them, something fixed, something they must simply endure, a cosmic schedule they are not allowed to understand, a hidden clock that will strike when the universe chooses, whether they are ready or not. But the deeper truth is more subtle. Divine timing is not random. And it is not only about when something can happen. It is also about when something can be sustained. That is a very different idea. Because many things can happen before they are ready to last. Contact can happen early. A conversation can happen early. An emotional return can happen early. A reunion scene can happen early. But if the field is still unstable, if the same wounds are still leading, if the nervous system still turns love into fear, if the old pattern still rules the bond, then outer movement may happen without becoming true reunion. This is why divine timing and emotional readiness are deeply connected. Not in a simplistic, heal enough and you'll get what you want way. Not in a blame-filled way. Not in a way that says you are personally causing every delay through imperfection. But in a deeper energetic way. Divine timing is not only about desire. It is about capacity. Capacity to receive. Capacity to remain present. Capacity to hold truth without collapsing back into distortion. Capacity for the connection to exist in a new frequency instead of repeating an old one. That is why timing is not just a calendar. It is a meeting point. A meeting point between soul movement and emotional readiness. Between what is sacredly possible and what can now be held without turning into the same old suffering. This is where many people misunderstand the timeline. They think, if the love is real, why not now? And that question is understandable. But maybe the deeper question is, if it happened now, what part of the old pattern would still take over? That is not punishment. That is wisdom. Because sacred reunion is not only about arriving. It is about arriving into a field that no longer instantly breaks under the weight of fear. Imagine planting something fragile in frozen soil. The seed may be real. The life inside it may be real. The potential may be undeniable. But if the soil is not yet able to hold it, the timing is not wrong because the seed is false. The timing is not yet right because the environment cannot sustain what is trying to emerge. This is how divine timing often works on the twin flame path. It is not saying no forever. It is saying, can what is trying to be born actually live here yet? That question changes everything. Because now timing becomes less mysterious in a helpless way, and more meaningful in a truthful way. The soul may know the bond is real. The longing may be real. The call toward reunion may be real. But can reunion now happen without immediately collapsing into panic, projection, dependency, control, or the old runner-chaser tension? That is where emotional readiness enters. And emotional readiness is not the same as perfection. This is important. Many people hear language about readiness and immediately turn it into pressure. I must heal completely. I must become flawless. I must transcend every wound before reunion is allowed. No. That is just the ego using spiritual language to create another impossible standard. Emotional readiness is not perfection. It is enough inner truth that the bond is no longer governed by the exact same distortions in the exact same way. Enough steadiness that silence no longer destroys identity. Enough self-return that reunion is no longer being asked to save you. Enough awareness that the old pattern is no longer invisible. Enough surrender that love is no longer passing through total resistance. That is very different from being perfectly healed. It is not about becoming beyond human. It is about becoming more honest, more available to truth, more able to receive without grasping, more able to love without turning the bond into survival. That is why divine timing often feels delayed to the ego. Because the ego wants events. But divine timing is often holding out for stability. Not a dramatic stability. A real one. The kind of stability that allows outer movement to become more than another emotional loop. This is also why some people experience contact long before they experience true reunion. They reconnect. They speak. They even come back into each other's lives. But the old dynamics quickly return. The fear returns. The confusion returns. The imbalance returns. The attachment returns. The pain returns wearing a different face. And what looked like the right time reveals itself to have been only movement, not yet readiness. That is one of the most humbling parts of this path. because it shows that timing is not simply about making something happen. It is about making space for what happens to mean something different this time. That is why divine timing and emotional readiness must be understood together. Divine timing is the sacred unfolding. Emotional readiness is the inner condition that can hold that unfolding without breaking it back into the old cycle. Neither one fully explains the journey alone. If you focus only on divine timing, you may become passive and helpless. If you focus only on emotional readiness, you may become self-blaming and hyper-controlling. But when you understand that timing is where soul movement meets inner capacity, the entire path begins making more sense. It is not random. It is relational. Not relational in the sense that you can force it. Relational in the sense that the outer world often reflects what the inner world has become able to sustain. This is why the most important question is not, when will divine timing decide? It is, what is becoming possible in me now that was not possible before? That question leads to truth. Because often, the answer is already there. You are calmer than you were. Less reactive. Less attached to the old outcome. Less trapped in checking, chasing, obsessing, and waiting for proof. More rooted in your own life. More willing to let reality be what it is without turning every silence into devastation. Those changes matter. They are not side notes to divine timing. They are part of it. Because divine timing is not only about the heavens. It is also about the human heart becoming more capable of truth. Think of music. A song is not only about the moment the note is played. It is also about whether the instrument is in tune enough to receive and express the note clearly. The timing of the note matters, yes. But if the instrument is not ready, the sound becomes distorted. So is the problem the note? Or the readiness of what is receiving it? That is the deeper layer of reunion. The love may already exist. The note may already be written. The call may already be sacred. But can the instrument hold the music differently now? That is emotional readiness. And that is why divine timing is not cruel. It is precise. Precise enough not to confuse movement with stability. Precise enough not to mistake longing for readiness. Precise enough to wait until the connection is not only possible, but more truthful than it used to be. This does not mean every delay is perfectly understandable from the human side. Some stages will still feel painful. Some silences will still feel unfair. Some parts of the journey will still stretch you beyond what feels reasonable. But even there, a deeper truth may still be operating. Timing is not only serving your desire. It is serving what the bond can actually hold. That is why reunion often comes not at the moment you wanted it most, but at the moment the old self could no longer carry it in the same way. And yes, that can be frustrating to hear. Because the human heart wants relief. But perhaps the soul wants something more than relief. Perhaps it wants truth strong enough to last. This is where divine timing becomes less about passive waiting and more about sacred ripening. Not waiting for the universe to randomly bless you. Becoming able to receive what was always too sacred to be held through the old pattern. That is a different kind of faith. A more mature faith. Not the faith that says, it will happen because I want it badly enough. But the faith that says, what is meant for truth will meet me when truth can hold it. That is divine timing in its deeper form. Not punishment. Not delay for delay's sake. Not emotional cruelty dressed as spirituality. Readiness meeting reality. And once you begin understanding that, another insight becomes impossible to ignore. The timeline may already be accelerating even if your ego still thinks nothing dramatic is happening. Because the final shift often does not arrive through spectacle. It arrives through quiet interchange. Chapter 9 Faster Than You Think. Why the final shift often happens quietly. There is one final illusion about the twin flame reunion timeline that must be broken. It is the illusion that the biggest shift will look dramatic. That when the timeline truly accelerates, you will know because everything becomes louder. More obvious. More emotional. More explosive. More impossible to miss. But the truth is often the opposite. the final shift frequently happens quietly. So quietly, in fact, that many people mistake it for nothing. They mistake it for detachment, for emotional fatigue, for the fading of the bond, for a strange empty stage where the signs feel less intense, the mind is less obsessed, and the heart is no longer screaming in the same way it once did. And because this stage does not flatter the ego's need for spectacle, people often overlook what it really is. Acceleration. That is the paradox. The reunion timeline may be moving faster than you think precisely when it no longer feels dramatic, enough to satisfy the old self. This is one of the deepest truths of the entire journey. Because for so long, the ego has been trained to equate movement with intensity. If it hurts more, something must be happening. If the signs are louder, something must be happening. If the emotions are overwhelming, something must be happening. If the longing is extreme, then surely reunion must be near. But intensity and alignment are not the same thing. Intensity can come from fear, from uncertainty, from resistance, from trauma loops, from the old wound desperately trying to pull clarity out of the future. Alignment, on the other hand, often feels simpler, cleaner, less dramatic, less performative, less emotionally chaotic. And because it feels so different from what came before, it can be almost unrecognizable at first. You may notice that the panic is lower, the checking is lower, the emotional urgency is weaker. The old obsession with timing has softened. And rather than feeling encouraged, part of you may feel afraid. Why? Because the old self trusted suffering more than stillness. The old self knew how to navigate intensity. It knew how to watch signs, decode silence, survive longing, and turn emotional pain into a measure of spiritual importance. But it did not know how to trust quiet. Quiet feels unfamiliar when you have lived in inner turbulence for a long time. That is why the final shift often gets misread. A person says, "I don't feel as desperate anymore. I'm not chasing like I used to. The bond still feels real, but somehow quieter. I still care, but the old panic isn't running me the same way." And instead of thinking, maybe something is finally aligning, they think, maybe I've lost it. But what if the opposite is true? What if the reason things feel quieter is because the distortion is finally losing its grip? What if the old pattern is dying, not the bond? That is the hidden acceleration. Because the timeline is not only about whether the outer world changes. It is about whether the old energetic conditions are still slowing the field down. And once those conditions begin collapsing, movement can happen very quickly even if the soul becomes quieter right before it does. This is why the final shift often happens in a stage that feels underwhelming to the ego. No emotional fireworks. No endless signs. No dramatic spiritual storm demanding immediate interpretation. Instead, there is often something subtler. A strange peace. A quiet confidence. A reduction in emotional chaos. A feeling that the old suffering no longer has the same authority. That may not feel like big movement at first. But spiritually, it may be the biggest movement of all. Because the final shift is not always about more. Often it is about less. Less resistance. Less fear. Less control. Less obsession. Less need for reunion to function as rescue. And that less matters more than people realize. Because as long as the field is crowded with panic, desperation, symbolic burden, and emotional repetition, the timeline feels heavy, slow, dragged down by the same old pattern. But once those things begin falling away, the path becomes lighter. And light things move differently. That is why the final shift can happen faster than you think. Not because it is random. Because what was slowing it down is no longer there in the same way. This is also why many people say things like, "I don't know what changed, but suddenly I felt different. I stopped needing the signs. I stopped forcing it. I stopped obsessing over when." And then, not long after, everything began shifting. To the ego, that sounds too simple. Surely it should be more dramatic than that. Surely a sacred shift should announce itself with signs in the sky, a cinematic confession, or an emotional breakthrough so intense that it silences all doubt. But truth often does not arrive that way. Truth often arrives like gravity. Quiet, unarguable, steady. It does not need to impress the ego. It simply begins rearranging reality from the inside out. That is why the final stage often feels so strange. You may still deeply sense the bond. You may still know something sacred is unfinished. You may still feel that reunion is possible, perhaps even close. But the way you hold it has changed. You are no longer dragging yourself through every day by signs alone. You are no longer turning silence into a catastrophe. You are no longer needing the next outer shift to prove the journey is alive. Instead, something in you begins to feel more present, more returned to self, more grounded in a truth that does not require constant external stimulation. That is the acceleration. Because now, the connection is no longer being filtered through the same distortion. And once distortion weakens, outer reality often begins softening too. This is where the title becomes real. Faster than you think. Not because the calendar suddenly speeds up. Not because time starts obeying desire. But because the soul can move quickly once the false obstacles begin dissolving. The old pattern dies. The old fear loses force. The old identity built around waiting becomes less convincing. The old need for control no longer grips the future in the same way. And because of that, the field becomes available for change. That availability is often invisible at first. You may simply notice that life feels less tight. The connection feels less tortured. The longing feels less desperate and more honest. Your own inner life feels more open, more real, more capable of holding uncertainty without collapsing. Those are not small signs. They are some of the deepest signs of all. Because the final shift is often not the moment you get what you want. It is the moment you become different enough that what comes next no longer has to pass through the old self. That is why it happens quietly. Because the old self always wanted volume. The soul wants truth. And truth does not need to shout. Imagine a door that has been stuck for years. You keep pushing harder, assuming force will make it open. More effort, more pressure, more frustration, more urgency. But the harder you push, the more the mechanism jams. Then one day you stop forcing. You become still enough to notice what was really blocking it. You release the pressure. You make one simple adjustment. And suddenly the door opens easily. To the frustrated mind, it can feel shocking. All this time, and it was that simple? But it was not simple. It was subtle. And subtle things are easy to miss when pain has trained you to look only for force. This is what the final shift often feels like on the twin flame journey. The old self keeps expecting one more giant emotional moment to prove everything is moving. But the soul is already making the quiet adjustment. The release. The surrender. The ending of the old energetic grip. And once that happens, the timeline can move with surprising speed. That is why the final stage often feels deceptively calm. Nothing may seem spectacular on the surface. And yet underneath, the old architecture is gone. The fear is weaker. The pattern is weaker. The need for rescue is weaker. The emotional dependency on signs is weaker. What remains is cleaner. And clean energy moves differently than tangled energy. So if you find yourself in a stage where things feel quieter, where the old obsession is no longer dominating, where the bond feels deeper but less dramatic, where the timeline matters but no longer controls your ability to live, do not rush to call that stagnation. Do not rush to assume nothing is happening. You may be standing in the exact phase where the timeline is moving faster than your ego can. Recognize. Because the ego looks for noise. The soul looks for truth. And truth often arrives in silence first. It arrives when the old lesson no longer needs to repeat. When the old fear no longer needs to dominate. When the old version of you can no longer carry the bond in the same distorted way. That is the final acceleration. Not outer proof first. Inner readiness first. Not more spectacle. More alignment. Not more pain to show you it matters. Less pain because what is false is finally ending. That is why the final shift often happens quietly. And that is why it may be happening much faster than you think. Even now. Especially now, if the old intensity is fading and something truer is taking its place. Because the most sacred movements do not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes they arrive like the air changing before rain. Like dawn before sunrise. Like a door unlocking before it opens. Quietly. Cleanly. Irreversibly. And once that truth is understood, only one thing remains. How do you close this journey of waiting, pain, and mystery with the right kind of faith? Not blind hope. Not ego fantase. But the kind of faith that can recognize that something real may already be unfolding. Chapter 10: The Final Truth. Your reunion timeline may already be moving. So now we arrive at the deepest truth of all. Not the truth the ego wants. Not a date. Not a guarantee. Not a final prediction about exactly when the message will come, when the silence will break, or when the outer reunion will finally take physical form. But a deeper truth than prediction. A truth about the nature of the timeline itself. If you have followed this journey closely, if you have felt the slowness, the longing, the silence, the repetition, the frustration, the strange peace, the surrender, the quiet shifts, the hidden acceleration beneath the surface, then perhaps you can already sense what this final chapter is trying to reveal. Your reunion timeline may already be moving even if your fear still cannot see it. That is the final paradox. Because for so long, you may have measured progress by what was missing. No message. No contact. No visible return. No outer proof. No dramatic sign big enough to calm the mind. And because of that, you may have believed the timeline was frozen. But what if it was never frozen? What if it was moving in the places you were not taught to trust? In your surrender. In your exhaustion with the old pattern. In the weakening of fear. In the strange calm after emotional chaos. In the moment you stopped needing reunion to save you. In the moment you no longer measured every day as evidence of absence. Those moments matter. They may not look dramatic. But they are the very moments that change the field. And once the field changes, time changes too. Not always in the outer world first. Not always in a way the ego immediately celebrates. But in truth. And truth is what actually moves the reunion timeline. Not fantasy. Not panic. Not emotional pressure. Not counting signs. Not begging the future to arrive fast enough to soothe the pain of the present. Truth. The truth that the same lesson may finally be ending. The truth that the old dynamic may finally be dying. The truth that love may no longer be passing through the same fear. The truth that your soul may now be more ready than it has ever been before. Even if your human mind still wants louder proof. That is why this final chapter is not about waiting harder. It is about seeing differently. Seeing that some of the fastest soul shifts do not happen in noise. They happen in silence. They happen when the ego stops making every day a crisis. They happen when the heart becomes less desperate for reassurance. They happen when the present is no longer treated like a punishment just because it has not yet become the future. That is sacred maturity. And sacred maturity changes timelines. Because a timeline is not only made of time. It is made of what consciousness is doing inside time. That sentence is everything. A year lived in panic is not the same as a year lived in truth. A month lived in resistance is not the same as a month lived in surrender. A day lived in self-abandonment is not the same as a day lived in self-return. The calendar may look the same. But the soul is not moving through the same field. And when the field changes, what once felt impossible can begin moving very quickly. That is why some twin flame reunions seem to happen out of nowhere. Because the visible shift was only the last stage of a much deeper invisible process. Maybe that is what has been happening for you. Maybe what looked like delay was actually preparation. Maybe what felt like silence was actually ripening. Maybe what felt like emptiness was the clearing away of everything that could not go with you into the next chapter. And maybe, perhaps more than your fear is willing to admit, the timeline is already changing. Because you are already changing. Not perfectly, but truly. Maybe you are no longer the same person who once lived entirely inside the ache. Maybe you are less reactive now, less dependent on the next sign, less willing to call suffering your only proof of love, less willing to abandon your own life while waiting for someone else to return. That is not nothing. That is enormous. Because reunion does not only ask, "Do you still want this?" It also asks, "Can you now hold this differently than before?" That is the deeper readiness. And if the answer is beginning to become yes, even quietly, even imperfectly, even without dramatic outer evidence yet, then the timeline may be far more alive than the mind assumes. This is the message I want to leave with you. Do not mistake quiet for slowness. Do not mistake less panic for less progress. Do not mistake peace for disconnection. Do not mistake the death of the old emotional drama for the death of the bond. Sometimes the path speeds up the moment it no longer needs to scream to get your attention. Sometimes the reunion timeline changes in the exact moment you stop relating to love as an emergency. Sometimes the final stage feels strangely calm because the soul is no longer feeding the old distortion. And that calm can be terrifying at first. Because the old self trusted intensity more than peace. It trusted signs more than stillness. It trusted struggle more than surrender. It trusted emotional pain more than quiet truth. But now, something else is becoming possible. A love that does not need to be dramatic to be real. A timeline that does not need to be visibly loud to be moving. A future that does not have to be forced in order to be forming. That is the deepest kind of trust. Not passive trust. Not denial. Not pretending the longing is gone. Real trust. The kind that says, "I do not need to see every invisible movement to know something is changing. I do not need to panic to prove this matters. I do not need to worship the clock to honor the connection. I do not need the old version of myself to survive in order for the story to continue." That is the final freedom. Not freedom from caring. Freedom from measuring your soul by what has not yet appeared. And from that freedom, something beautiful begins to happen. You stop living as if the timeline owns you. You stop handing your breath over to the future. You stop making "not yet" into your identity. You stop assuming silence means abandonment. You stop calling the absence of outer proof the absence of all progress. And when you stop doing that, you begin living in a completely different field. A field where the bond can still be sacred without controlling your nervous system. A field where the future can still matter without imprisoning the present. A field where the reunion timeline is no longer a sentence you are serving, but a truth unfolding in layers. That is how this journey changes. Not always through one giant breakthrough, but through 1,000 quiet endings. The ending of panic. The ending of resistance. The ending of repetition. The ending of the need for rescue. The ending of the story that said your life could only begin once reunion happened. Those endings are holy. Because every false thing that ends makes room for what is real to come closer. And if that is where you are now, if you feel quieter, clearer, less desperate, more rooted, even while the outer world is still unfinished, then hear this carefully. You are not necessarily far away. You may be much closer than you think. Closer not because of a sign. Closer not because the ego finally got a prediction. Closer because something in you is no longer feeding the very things that made the path feel so long. That is the true acceleration. And once it begins, the outer world often has a way of catching up faster than the old self believed possible. So trust what is softening. Trust what no longer feels meaningful in the old cycle. Trust what is falling away. Trust the peace that feels unfamiliar. Trust the quiet that does not perform. Because the twin flame reunion timeline is not always moving in the way the ego expects. But it may be moving more deeply, more quickly, and more truthfully than you realize. And maybe that is the message your soul needed most. Not that reunion is guaranteed on your preferred timeline, but that nothing real is lost in the silence where truth is still preparing itself. That is the final truth. The timeline may feel slow to the part of you that watches the clock. But to the soul, the most important shifts may already be underway. And once the soul is ready, outer reality can change faster than you think. If this message found you at the exact right moment, write in the comments. My reunion is unfolding. And if you are walking the twin flame journey through separation, surrender, spiritual awakening, and deep inner transformation, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we go beyond fantasy and into the real psychology, soul truth, and sacred shifts behind twin flame reunion. And if this video spoke to you, share it with someone who feels like their timeline is stuck when in truth, it may already be moving more than they know.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.